and get started. Okay, so as I say, I'm Dan Stone from CSE. We're helping the hub administer their fund and acting as a sort of critical friend for organisations putting in applications. And this is the third seminar in a series being delivered for the hub. And essentially what it's trying to do is kind of help groups like yourselves, perhaps getting newly established, to take the right decisions in an informed way about kind of getting established and incorporated, basically, because there's lots of different organizational structures that are suitable for community energy groups to adopt, depending on what the group wants to do, really. And so it's a big decision to try and choose the right form of incorporation for you, basically. And so this webinar is devised to help you with that decision. So what we're going to have is some experts, Laura Moss and Simon Borkin, talking for about half an hour on basically why you need to get incorporated, what you need to know, and different forms of legal entity. And then we've got established community energy groups that are going to talk about their experiences, basically. And then at about 8:50, we've got about 15 minutes for questions. And then we'll aim to sort of finish up about 9:15 to 9:30, basically. So you should be done by 9:30. So now what I'm going to do is pass on to James Johnson from the Northwest Energy Hub, who's just going to give a 5-minute intro to the webinar and set the context for it, basically. Okay, over to you, James.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me a bit better. I've bumped up my volume. Is that any better, Dan?
It's still pretty quiet, but carry on. Oh, maybe it's just my computer.
No, I worry it's mine. So I'm a technical expert advisor who works for local government who can't manage Zoom properly, so I apologise for that. It's nice to meet everyone. I'm going to sit in the background today. So the Northwest Hub is one of the 5 hubs, and government is using us as a vehicle to deliver community energy funds to the region. So we have a grant programme that I hope you're aware of. But around that, we wanted a wrapper of support to help groups understand sort of how to interact with the sector and what it does. So community energy, Centre for Sustainable Energy, Dan and Ailsa on the call from CAG are helping us do that. So we're hoping that you're getting the wraparound support you need in the Northwest. And indeed, if you're from further afield, we don't mind that. We want to spread the knowledge. So yeah, Dan set out the agenda for today. I hope we've got some great speakers. I hope you find it all useful. And come the end, we'll have to see what you've made of it and perhaps ask you what other things you might like to learn more about. I suspect we've got a mixed ability group. Some of you may be kind of evolved and thinking about your next steps. Some of you may be just at the beginning of thinking about how a community energy group is sort of established different from, say, other third sector organisations. So I hope that covers it, Dan. I've something to say at the end about a consultation that's currently out. I don't want to forget that, but from my point of view,
that's great. Okay, now we're going to pass on to Laura Moss, who's a partner from Wrigleys Solicitors, who's a great expert and knows tons about getting incorporated. And she's just going to talk you through kind of what you need to know, really. So we'll have about 20 minutes from her. Are you there, Laura?
I'm here, yeah, hello.
Oh, there you go. Sorry.
Nothing as nerve-wracking has been introduced as an expert, so hopefully I won't disappoint. I'm going to try and share my screen. If it doesn't work, then please somebody shout up, but hopefully we have practiced it, so it should be okay. Right. Does that work? Can you see that okay? Yeah, great. Okay. So as
actually, Laura, we're seeing your notes.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, it's in presentation mode, Laura. We're seeing the double slide. See if you can share the screen, perhaps.
Let me just exit. Okay, right. I'll just stop sharing and then just try and sort that out. Hang on. If I have to do it in presentation mode, it's not the end of the world. Oh, that might be better.
Yeah, that's working now.
That's good.
Oh, okay. Oh, good. Oh, fine. Great. So as Dan kind of said, I do lots of work with community energy groups and all sorts of charities and social enterprises. That's my entire legal career is based on working for charities, social enterprises and community groups. So I consider myself very fortunate because I get to work with people who are doing good things for the world. What I'm going to talk to you about today is obviously legal structures for community energy groups specifically. Some of you may have already come across Wrigleys. We're a specialist law firm in this sector. We do lots of work for charities and social enterprises and community groups. That's pretty much, we have a department that does that, which I work in, and we also have a private client department, and then we're supported by property teams and pension teams, and that's it. We don't do other stuff. So it's very niche, but very enjoyable. We've worked with lots of community energy organisations over the years, including Bay Wind, which is one of the, I think it was the first community wind farm, and we set up Energy for All as well. So we've kind of got a very long heritage in the sector. Energise Barnsley is one of the perhaps the more recent big ones that we've worked with. And you're welcome to ask questions along. I know there's going to be time at the end for questions, but don't hesitate to stick stuff in the chat as you're going along while you think of questions. If I don't notice them in the chat, someone perhaps like Dan might remind me to answer them at the end, but I know it's quite helpful, isn't it? Sometimes when you think of a question, it's worth just popping them in the chat there and then. So I've been asked to cover the points that are on the slide at the moment. So we're going to look at why you might incorporate. We're going to do a bit of jargon busting because I think there's some terminology which is used, which can be a bit confusing sometimes. I'm going to outline different forms of legal entity, talk a little bit about registration and regulation, and then I'm going to just include a final slide, which is more of a practical thing about how you actually go about choosing a legal structure. And it'll become clear why I'm doing that when we get there. So in terms of why you might incorporate, there are two main benefits really of incorporation. The first is that you have a separate legal personality if you're an incorporated entity. It means you can own property and other assets, and you can enter into contracts in the name of the legal entity. In contrast, if you're unincorporated, you own the organisation. A group of people might come together, but you own property and other assets and enter into contracts in the name of the individuals involved because you've not got a separate legal entity. So, for example, I work with lots of clubs and societies. Some of those clubs and societies are unincorporated, so anything they do is in the name of the individuals because they've not got that separate legal identity. The other big advantage is that incorporated entities have got limited liability, and the people involved in running the organisation have got limited liability as long as they're acting in accordance with governing documents and complying with their legal duty. And that's why there's that caveat in that bottom left box that says that there is personal liability in certain circumstances. So directors and trustees, or the people who are responsible for running the organisation, even where you've got an incorporated entity, you've got that wrapper, the corporate wrapper around the structure. Usually that corporate wrapper acts as a protective shell for the people involved. Occasionally, in certain circumstances, that corporate veil, the corporate shell can be breached. And the main times that it's breached are if there are health and safety offences, or if directors continue to trade when they know the organisation's insolvent, if they wrongful trading or fraudulent trading. And that's usually in an insolvency situation. So just to be aware of that there are those kind of exceptions to this general rule about limited liability. And then in contrast, if you're unincorporated, the individuals may become personally liable for debts and liabilities. And that's a particular issue if there are large or unusual contracts, if you enter into funding arrangements which need repaying as opposed to grants, if you're employing people, or if you're leasing or buying property, because all those things involve risks which you might want to protect yourself from as individuals involved in the running of the organisation. And I think in the context of community energy groups, actually, there are really good reasons for community energy groups in particular to be incorporated because they might own land or lease land. They're likely to need to enter into contracts. Some of those contracts might be quite high value ones, and they might also employ people. And all this is much easier to do if you're incorporated because you can enter into those arrangements in the organisation's name. And it also means you've got that limited liability as well. There is a cost associated with incorporation, and that is there's more transparency and accountability if you're incorporated. You end up having to be registered and regulated, registered with somebody, be that Companies House or the Financial Conduct Authority, and regulated by that body as well. Yeah, so in general, I think there's lots of advantages to it, but there are it's worth bearing in mind that it's not always a straightforward picture. A quick bit of jargon busting is people get very confused about the difference between members and directors. In an incorporated structure, there are two levels of governance. You have the members or the shareholders, and then you have the directors. You might also call the directors the board or the trustees or the management committee. Now, the members or the shareholders are the owners of the organisation. They're the people who make the big directional decisions. They hold the board of directors to account. And there are certain rights and responsibilities that are reserved to those people in the constitution of the organisation, but also in law. So in law, they generally have the right or responsibility to change the structure of the organisation, to change the governing document, or to decide to wind the organisation up. They might also have responsibility for electing directors, and depending on the legal structure, they usually have the right in law to remove the directors as well. So they've got it's that top level of governance, the owners, the buck stops with them. And it's worth noting, Simon's going to come afterwards to talk about community share issues, but it's worth noting that if you do a community share issue, your investors are the shareholders. So when you do a community share issue, the people who buy those shares are the members or the shareholders, and they hold that upper level of governance. It means that you're opening up the control of your organisation to that potentially quite a wide group there. In contrast, the directors, who might also be called the management committee or the board, are the people who supervise the running of the organisation. So they're responsible for its day-to-day running. Things like approving legal agreements, reviewing financial accounts and budgets. In charities, I'm not going to talk about charities very much tonight because it's not really relevant to community energy organisations, because for right or wrong, the generation of energy, renewable energy, isn't a charitable purpose. So we're not going to touch on charitable status really. But in charities, the directors are generally the same people as trustees. So people talk about trustees and directors and management committees all being different people, but they're not. Generally, they are the same people generally. In some roles, particularly with small organisations or startups, lots of these roles might be undertaken by the same individuals. So members and directors might be the same people. It keeps the running of the organisation very tight. But an open membership is where the members and the shareholders are different from the directors. It's usually a bigger group, and that would happen if you do a community share issue. But however you structure it, whatever the case is, even if people are acting both as directors and as members, they need to make sure they've got the right hat on. We talk about this concept of different hats. So they need to know in what capacity they're making decisions, whether they're making a decision as a member or as a director. And then an organisation might also be various other roles within the organisation, such as the chair, the treasurer, the secretary. Secretary might be a separate person, might just be an officer who isn't a director. They're just another status, another officer that the organisation has. However, the chair and the treasurer, they tend to be people who are drawn from the directors. So you don't usually have in law, there's no such thing as like a separate chair or treasurer of a company or a society. And they're usually drawn from the board. And then employees don't form part of the formal legal governance structure. They're just employed by the organisation. It goes without saying. But you do need to watch out for situations where either members or directors want to be paid as employees. It usually adds a bit of a layer of complexity, especially where an organisation is charitable. So it's just worth bearing in mind that you might have a director who is an employee, but you just need to make sure that's permitted by your governing document. And then the other thing I just wanted to clarify, because this is another thing that can confuse people quite a lot, is this idea of an asset lock. So asset locks refer to the way in which assets are locked into the organisation and held in perpetuity for its objects. So if you follow the flowchart round, I'll leave you to read that. I won't read the words out, but I'll try and give you a bit of put a bit of flesh on the bones for you to try and explain what this means. So the asset locking ensures that any property which the organisation owns can only ever be used for the purpose of its objects and not, for example, sold for private gain. It usually means that assets can't be given away or sold for less than market value unless it's to another asset lock body or for the benefit of the community. It means it would prevent assets from being sold to members or residents of the organisation for less than full market value. Asset locks are found in charities, some community benefit societies and community interest companies. there's sometimes quite a bit of confusion over what the asset lock actually means, and that's why I've included it here. It doesn't mean that the assets of an organisation can't ever be sold. It doesn't prevent the sale of assets completely. It's a lock on the organisation rather than on a particular asset per se. It doesn't stop an organisation engaging in its ordinary business, and it wouldn't prevent a disposal to some other asset locked body. In its simplest form, it's just intended to protect the assets of an organisation for the community, or for public purpose, rather than any private or personal gain of the members of the organisation.
Laura, I just wanted, sorry to interrupt, you mentioned objects, and I just wondered if you were able to explain what the kind of objects of the organisation were. Maybe you're coming to it, in which case I'll shut up.
No, I can happily explain that. So the objects of an organisation are its purposes, and it's usually set out in its constitution. So its governing document will usually have objects which set out what that organisation does. So a private profit-making company, it will just say something like it's a general purpose company, whereas some of the organisations we're going to be talking about in a second were much more prescriptive and say that it's all about the generation of community energy, for example. Okay. So yeah, asset locks, briefly, you can get various types of asset lock, and I think of it as a bit of a spectrum. So everything, so the tightest asset lock would be a charitable asset lock. So charities have a limitation on what they can do with their assets. There are statutory asset locks, which are prescribed in law. So legislation sets out wording which can be put into the governing documents of certain types of entity, non-charitable community benefit societies and community interest companies, both of which we're going to come on to. So if you're a bit mystified about what those organisations are, do not fear, we'll come on to that. And then you can also have a voluntary asset lock, but that's the sort of the weakest end of the spectrum, because basically they're susceptible to a removal by a decision of the members. The members could just choose to remove that lock on what the organisation can do with its assets. So that's a little bit of context. We're now going to just talk about the legal structures. So in brief, unincorporated entities are, we're usually looking at trusts, associations and partnerships. I'm not going to cover those in any more detail than that, because they're not generally something I would recommend, particularly in this sector, because of the reasons I said before. There's, you're dealing with contracts and things where there might be risks, and it's better to be incorporated. In terms of incorporated structures, the main ones we're looking at are companies which can be limited by guarantee or limited by shares. Both guarantee companies and share companies could be community interest companies. So I will explain those in a slightly more detail in a second. We're also going to look at societies, and societies can be split into two types: community benefit societies or cooperative societies. And I will talk about those briefly, but I think Simon's going to give a bit more detail on those as well. And then there are also incorporated entities. CIOs are a type of charitable structure, so I'm not going to touch on them apart from saying that, because as I explained before, we're not really looking at charities today. And then limited liability partnerships, and again, I'm not really going to touch on those because they're quite specific. There's quite specific circumstances when you would use those. So we're going to focus today on companies and societies. So share companies are the most common type of structure. It's probably the entity that the general public understands best. They are largely used for private enterprises, generally used for trading companies in their own right, and they exist really to distribute profits to shareholders rather than for community benefit or the wider community use. So there's lots of advantages to them. They're very quick and cheap to set up. You can use them to raise share capital, what we call equity. They're malleable. You can amend the governance structure and the articles, the rule book, to suit what you need to do, and they're really well recognised. They're internationally recognised as a legal structure. I think the disadvantage is, particularly in this sector, they're not really seen as community or socially focused. Guarantee companies, in contrast, are generally used for social enterprises. So if you talk about social enterprise, often people are talking about a guarantee company or a community interest company, which we will come on to in a second. They've got the same advantages as a share company in that they're quick and cheap to incorporate, and they're well recognised, and they're very flexible. The drawback with them is that because they don't have share capital, they're limited by guarantee instead of being limited by shares. You can't issue shares in them, so you can't raise equity investment. You can potentially accept grants, but otherwise you can only issue debt. You can't issue shares. The current incorporation fees to set up a share company or a guarantee company at the moment, it's only £10. You pay a £10 fee to Companies House. That's about to change on the 1st of May. It goes up to, I think it's £50 for their standard service. So it is quite a big jump, but we're still talking about relatively small beer, really. 50 quid's not that much in the grand scheme of things. So I talk about the concept of wrappers. So you start off with the company limited by shares or guarantee. You can then add this extra wrapper around it, which is the community interest company. So you add in, and what you're doing is you're adding in an asset lock which protects the social mission of the company. So Dan asked the question about what objects are. In a community interest company, you would include objects which talk about what the company is going to do in how it's going to benefit the community. So it might be something like it's going to generate community energy to benefit the wider community by improving the environment, sustainability, etc., providing low cost energy to the community. And community interest companies, whether they are based on a guarantee company or a share company, have got that asset lock that we talked about. So there's wording that's set out in law, which has to be in the rules and the articles of the community interest company, which limits what the organisation can do with its assets. Because of that, because it's got those, the objects have to be for community benefit, and because the assets are protected, it's a really strong structure which demonstrates that community interest is protected. It makes them quite attractive because that social mission is then locked in, and some grant funders are willing to fund community interest companies because they've got that lock on their assets. Many grant funders will only fund charities, but I do know of some. I have come across some examples where KICs have been funded by grant funders because of that asset lock. So it's just quite useful, really, as a thing to know about. There are a few disadvantages. So there's additional regulation. You have to make an annual statement in your accounts showing how you've met community interest in that particular year. And there are prescribed statements in the Articles of Association. So the law states that there has to be certain clauses included in your rule book, and occasionally clients have found that a bit tricky. Like we've had to adapt a governance structure to meet those legislative requirements. It didn't quite, what's set out in law didn't quite do what we needed it to do, but you've not got any choice. You have to just have those clauses in the rule book. And then there's a few peculiarities. So I mentioned the asset lock that's in there. There's also a cap on the dividends. So guarantee companies don't have shareholders, so can't pay dividends to any members or shareholders. Share companies, if you're a share company that's a community interest company, you can pay dividends out to your shareholders, but there's a limit on what you can pay. So at the moment, I think it's 35%. So only 35% of your distributable profits could go to your shareholders. The rest has to be reinvested into the company. There's nothing stopping you reinvesting all of it into the company or putting it back into the community, but it's just worth bearing in mind that you've got that kind of limit again on what you can do. So the other type of structure, this is a very whistle-stop tour, but that's the kind of companies with potentially the community interest company wrapper. On the other side of things, we've got societies. So some of you might have heard of industrial and provident societies, or IPSs, and these were effectively the predecessor to community benefit societies and cooperatives. The Cooperative and Community Benefit Societies Act 2014 codified a lot of previous legislation. And there are two types of societies which are possible under that law. There's community benefit societies and cooperative societies. Now, community benefit societies exist for the wider communities, the benefit of the wider community, whereas generally speaking, cooperatives exist for the benefit of its members. So that's the two main distinctions. CBSs tend to be used, we see them a lot for housing associations, responsible lenders, community facilities, anything where you want that wider community ownership and benefit. They're democratic, lots of engagement with the community. The starting principle is that it's one member, one vote, regardless of how much investment a person has, how many shares a person has. And they can be charitable or they can be non-charitable with a statutory asset lock, which is if they're non-charitable with a statutory asset lock, then they're pretty similar to a KIC, to a community interest company. Alternatively, they can be neither a charity or asset locked. Now, there's limited flexibility in the Constitution. They're governed by a set of rules. The FCA has to approve that rule book, and then it has to approve any changes to that rule book. And I'll come on to some difficulties that might give rise to in a second. The final thing to note is with both CBSs and cooperatives, you can issue shares. So Simon will come on to this, but it means it's quite a handy way of raising capital. So cooperative societies, as I mentioned, they are generally for the benefit of the community, of the residents, of the owners, of the members, as opposed to being for the resident of the community, benefit of the community. The reason why I mentioned before the FCA can cause some difficulties is that we've had historically, they've not particularly liked the use of cooperative societies for community energy organisations. Again, Simon might have a comment on this, but the FCA took a view that community energy organisations can't be cooperatives because of what they saw as a lack of involvement from investor members and benefits to the wider community. So they've been pushed into being community benefit societies instead. So we've been involved in long arguments with them about this and about what a cooperative is in law. And we've not got time to go into this tonight, but the upshot is community energy organisations might find it hard or possibly even impossible to register as a cooperative society. So I won't say any more about co-ops there, but if anyone's got any questions, then I'm more than happy to answer them.
Laura,
and then just very, yeah.
I was just wondering, we're starting to run out of time a bit. So if you could sort of.
That's fine. I've got two. Yeah, I will very quickly whiz through these last few slides. So in terms of registration and regulation, I've just got two slides to just demonstrate the difference really. Companies are governed by articles of associations and they're registered with Companies House. KICs are also registered with the KIC regulator. Directors' duties are codified in law, so they're set out in law. And to register, you submit everything to Companies House or the KIC regulator. And then you've got annual obligations to file accounts or an annual confirmation statement with Companies House. In contrast, societies, nothing to do with companies, completely different set of legislation governed by the Cooperative and Community Benefit Societies Act, registered with and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, the Mutuals Registry Team. And the director's duties aren't set out in law, they're derived from common law instead. So it means there's a little bit more sort of vagueness maybe around what those duties are. And you register with the FCA, but you've got the same kind of annual obligations in terms of filing accounts and an annual return. So what I was going to just say finally is that when it comes to choosing what legal structure you should be, form follows function, or form should follow function. So I would always say to anybody that the first thing to do is clarify what your objectives are and then use those to choose what your legal structure should be, rather than choosing your legal structure and then working out if that's the right fit for you. And this slide just shows some of the key considerations, some of the questions you should be asking yourself about what your aims are. Control is at the centre, because I think that's a really crucial one. And that really, what I mean by that is, do you want the organisation to be controlled by a wide membership involving wide members of the community, or do you want the members and directors to be the same people and keep it very tight, a tight governance structure? Do you want external stakeholders to be represented, for example, on the board, people like local authorities, community bigwigs, schools? Do you want board members to be paid? Do you want employees on the board? Who benefits? Is it the members mainly benefiting, or is it the wider community? And then looking at where your funding is going to come from. Are you going to be reliant on grant funding? Are you going to be selling goods or services, entering into contracts? And then finally, your end goals. So are you looking at something that's a very time limited project, or is it something that's open ended and potentially going off into the future forever and ever and ever? And thinking about that succession planning at the beginning can be quite a useful thing to do. That is all for now, but if anyone's got any questions, then by all means put it in the chat. Thanks.
That was really good, Laura. That was great. Really interesting. I think what we'll do is we'll crack on unless there are any questions. And now we're going to hear from Simon Borkin, who's a consultant and practitioner and researcher with Commonly, and a specialist in cooperatives and community benefit societies.
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, I'm going to just, I think Laura gave you a really good overview of the various different legal forms and governance considerations. I suppose I'm just going to go a bit more into detail on the sort of cooperative option and introduce community shares, which has been a really powerful and valuable way for community energy societies to raise capital for their projects. So I'll just share my screen, which should work. Hopefully everyone can see that. Okay. Yeah. So yes, I'm as Dan said, I work with all sorts of different societies, and I've supported societies use community shares, and many of those have been community energy projects around the UK. But just to kind of, I suppose, the big picture about why we think cooperatives is a really powerful legal form is because basically it's a way of establishing businesses that are owned and run by people like us, people around the table. So whatever hat you're wearing, a customer, an employer, an employee, a supplier, a resident, or the wider community. And the idea is that people come together and collectively decide how that business runs and how the profits are used. And I think it's that sentiment, which is why that really aligns well with community energy, because it's often communities coming together to collectively invest and run renewable energy assets, and people want to do that in a democratic and equitable way. So I think something that I think is really I find when working with societies across the board, irrespective of sector, but I think it still really applies for community energy societies, is this idea that you've got these 4 cornerstones that all interlink. So the idea is that community engagement, the business model, how you use finance, and how you govern that, how you govern the organization, they all work together and they all reinforce each other. And I think, so you have to kind of keep all these elements in mind when you're setting up your community energy society, how the 4 are going to interact. So it's always useful to have those all like in front of your mind. But just to kind of give a bit of headline theory. So basically the idea is that a business generally would have 4 key stakeholders. So the workers, customers, suppliers, and investors in order to function. And basically a business will adopt a form of governance to basically work out the optimum relationship between those stakeholders. So commercial companies in the capitalist model gives primacy to investors, but actually a cooperative, it gives primacy to other stakeholders. So that could be a worker co-op where the workers own the business, or a consumer co-op where customers own the business, or a supplier co-op where suppliers or producers own the business. As Laura said, that one of the really powerful models for community energy societies and other community co-ops is this community benefit society, and they are co-ops, but the idea is that you're giving those stakeholders, you're bringing all those stakeholders together. It's for wider community purpose. And as Laura said, cooperatives can operate under a variety of legal form, but mainly we may use the society legal form because that bakes in all those elements into the model. So again, just to kind of recognize the fact that there's these different varieties of society, and the reason why there are these different forms of society is really to recognize that there's a slight difference in where the benefit lies. So a cooperative society will exist purely for member benefit, and that is where there has been issues around a community energy society registering as a pure cooperative society because it's difficult to demonstrate the member benefit beyond just investment. So that's why the majority will sit in that middle piece, that community benefit society, because it recognises that there's a wider community benefit there. You've got the asset lock, but again, it doesn't go quite to a charitable model, because as Laura said, the generation of renewable energy isn't recognised as a charitable public benefit. So that kind of community benefit society has been the sweet spot for community energy organisations, because it balances the ability to have members, generate community benefit, and have an asset lock all in one kind of legal form. So I won't go into too much detail because I know we're a bit short on time, but as we said, the cooperative society will be its business will be for purely member benefit, and as a result, the profits can be distributed amongst the members, and there would be usually a mechanism to distribute profits based on transactions with the society. The community benefit society, this is where the conduct business must be for the benefit of the community. So while it has members, it's the community as a whole that is the intended beneficiary. And on that basis, the idea is that profits can't be distributed to the members, but would be used to benefit the broader community. And again, the idea is that on that basis, if it was wound up, then the asset society would be used for community benefit, and that's guided by the asset lock. I won't go into the charitable community benefit society legal form, but it does exist. So that's where you have a community benefit society with charitable status. But again, it's unlikely that a community energy society would be able to operate under this model. So I'll just quickly talk about how the society legal form provides a mechanism to raise finance. And I suppose the key thing is that finance in a cooperative basically works like the same way as for a conventional business, but it's basically seen as the other way. The use of finance in the business works the other way around in a cooperative to a conventional business, in that in a conventional enterprise, it's generally investment and ownership determines how that organization works, whereas in a community, it's the members that are in control, and so you need finance to reflect that different ownership model. And this is seen most clearly in terms of how equity investment is used in a cooperative. So in a traditional company, a business would often issue ordinary shares, and they would be transferable, so they could be sold to another person, and they would be non-withdrawable, so there wouldn't be an obligation for the company to buy those shares back. And the other kind of element is generally that they would carry some ownership rights. So one share, the percentage of shares would determine control. And generally the ability to kind of, for businesses to transfer shares would be through listing it on a stock market or selling the business. But these aren't viable routes for cooperatives. So on that basis, there's a different form of equity or share capital in a society to overcome the different way that a cooperative works. So the actual instrument, the financial instrument, is called withdrawable share capital, but it's often referred to as community shares because it's just a little bit more accessible and informative. But the idea is it provides a viable exit route for investors in cooperatives because it can be withdrawn by the shareholder subject to terms and conditions set by the organisation. So essentially the organisation pays the investor back their share investment at a later date. And it's unique to cooperative and community benefit societies. And often there's some restrictions or terms and conditions on how those shares can be withdrawn. So there's usually a period of notice, a limit on the amount of share capital that can be withdrawn in one financial year, and the organisation would have the right to suspend withdrawals if necessary. So it basically ensures that the organisation is balancing its requirements to manage its investment with its wider community benefit. So basically, why community shares? Basically, it provides really long-term risk capital because generally community members that are investing are willing to invest on a longer term basis and are aligned with the values and the objectives of the organisation. It can often lever in further funding because basically, if the community invest, it crowds in other forms of finance because it shows that the community want to see this thing happen. It's democratic because irrespective of the amount of shares that anyone holds, it's still one member, one vote. So it gives all members meaningful involvement in the running of the society. And the other idea is it's sustainable because you're basically, by giving your community an opportunity to invest, you're baking them in, and it means they're more likely to be advocates, they're more likely to volunteer for the society, they're more likely to become board member because they feel a sense, they have a real credible sense of ownership within the organisation. So yeah, just a few other kind of characteristics of community shares. So again, it's withdrawable and non-transferable share capital. And what that means is that those shares are not subject to speculation or capital gain. So if you invest £100 of withdrawable share capital, it won't increase in value. And that again is to recognise that the motivation for investing in a society is not primarily for financial gain. It's for it's because people want to support the purpose of what the organisation does. It's one member, one vote. The other thing to be aware of is there is an upper limit on individual member investment. That limit is relatively high, so it's £100,000 based on the legislation. So an individual can invest quite a substantial sum, but the idea is that there are some limits on the amount that an individual can invest, and best practice would actually suggest that societies maybe reduce the amount that they allow members to invest, to make sure that even though it's one member, one vote, that people don't have a disproportionate financial stake in the business. Another key element is that the ability to issue community shares is actually exempt from most of the financial promotion regulations. So it makes it more affordable for a society to issue these, because they don't have to go through a lot of legal and financial due process to be able to promote a share offer. However, the other thing that's quite important is that the shares, you can pay interest on shares, and the idea there is you're offering a level sufficient to attract investment. So quite often it will be the interest payment will be dictated by the business plan. But you'll see anything from some societies issuing no interest to maybe 7-8%, and especially now we're in a slightly higher interest rate landscape. The idea is that if a society wants to attract investment, they might have to think about it in relation to other forms of investment products that are available, but recognizing that it is primarily a social investment. And then basically, ultimately, the society needs to have a means to allow people to withdraw their shares over time. So while there will generally be a suspension, because the idea is you want some time to allow the society to start to trade, generate revenue and turnover, there should be a realistic long-term plan for allowing people to withdraw their shares, and that should be reflected in the final financial forecast when a society promotes a share offer. So there's lots of different ways that they can potentially replace the capital. So it might be moving to an open offer where new members can replace members withdrawing their investments. You can obviously build up reserves to fund withdrawals of share capital. Quite often in community energy projects, because they all have a finite lifespan, so a solar farm or a wind turbine will have, say, a 25-year depreciation. So essentially you can use that to then fund withdrawals, recognizing that at some point that asset will no longer be operating and generating income. And there may be other options.
So you'll be able to start to wrap up as well.
Yeah, so I've just got a couple of slides. So basically, just in terms of how energy sits within the kind of community shares landscape, I just put a couple of slides here from Cooperative UK, did some really good research on community shares, and it had some useful information about the average kind of community energy raise. So community energy are generally the largest investment projects. So they'll be looking, we'll have an average deal value of around £500,000, of which the equity will often be 2/3 of the financing package. So around 300,000 is sort of the average share offer raise for a community energy project, but they can be much bigger and much smaller. But it just gives you a sense of the sort of value of the amount of capital that is often raised through a community share offer for an energy project. And then I just thought this was a useful graphic because it actually shows that energy was a very substantial part of the community shares space, but it's now become slightly smaller. So it's about 14% of share offers now in the energy space. There's been a lot of other kind of sectors that are now using this model, but it is still quite an important way that societies are raising capital. And then again, just to show you kind of community shares are happening all across the UK. And the Northwest has actually been a particularly popular region for community share offers, had over nearly 100 offers in the last 10 years. But yeah, I'll wrap up there. So I appreciate that was very bit of a speedy run through.
That's all right. Thanks very much, Simon. Okay, so what we're going to do, I think what we'll do is sort of take the questions at the end. And so we're now going to hear from 3 experienced community organisation groups community energy groups that have been incorporated for some while. Sorry, couldn't get my words out. So first of all, Catriona Coburn, and if you're able to just talk for 5 minutes, because we're maximum 5 minutes because we're running a bit late. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Hi everyone. I'm from Energise South Downs, which is based in Petersfield in Hampshire. We chose to be a community benefit society. As Laura pointed out, I suppose you have to sort of have a sort of clear vision and mission before you're thinking about what legal entity you want it to be. Our main focus for our community energy group is to energy generation projects. So we knew that we would be going out to raise capital, do share raises. So we're not for profit, and we wanted the community benefit to be for the wider community rather than members. So we felt that the CBS was the right legal entity for us. We found when we were looking into it, it was fairly straightforward, I suppose, not a huge administration or legislative burden. There's quite clear sort of templates and model rules set out. We found the Cooperative's UK website very good. When you're thinking about registering, there's a good site called Simply Legal, and you can use a sort of very interactive site where you are thinking about your mission, and it takes you through what you're trying to achieve and what legal entity would fit your objectives. What else can I tell you? Your other questions, what we'd wish we'd known before getting incorporated. I suppose groups like this, being on a hub, talking to other groups. I spoke to Brighton Community Energy, Birmingham Community Energy, finding out how they started off, why they chose their legal entity. There's lots of kind of support out there. The Cooperative's UK website, as I say, is really informative. Speak to legal teams, often very helpful local legal teams. And what groups need to know about governing and administering their group once incorporated. So as a community benefit society, you're registered with the Mutual Society. As Laura pointed out, there's a clear set of rules and governance and legal obligations, but they're quite clearly set out. So about the directors, how you hold your meetings, how you minute things, who's a member, how you become a member, about your annual return when you hold your AGM. So it's kind of clearly set out, and so we found that all very helpful and not too burdensome. Something that always comes up when we're applying for grants is about what happens if there's always a winding up clause. So as long as that's in your constitution, often grants and funders want to know and be directed to that within your constitution. So that comes up every time. Is that a quick summary? Was there anything else?
No, that's great. I'm sure there'll be questions afterwards, which is fine. And now, Phil, if you could do the same, Phil Beardmore.
Thank you, Dan. Community Energy Birmingham became a community benefit society because we met a number of people in Birmingham had wanted to set up a community energy vehicle for some years. And in about 2010, we met a chap called Keith Richardson, who had set up several renewable energy co-ops in the Northeast. And we got support from him and Co-ops UK and Pure Leapfrog. And Keith supported us until he sadly died in 2016. I'd been a member of several co-ops, but none of us had founded a co-op before. I think the question for me, what I've been asked to answer is, what do I wish that we had known then that we know now? And I think for me, that is about the qualities of a good board member. And that's not just about responsibilities, but it's about the behaviours of a good board member. And this isn't just about Community Energy Birmingham, but it's about other renewable energy co-ops that I know of, and other co-ops more widely that I am a member of. And I think when we started up in 2012, in common with most renewable energy co-ops, we thought that the qualification to be on the board was anybody who thought that renewable energy was a good idea. And you didn't need any particular skills or experience. There wasn't a role description. But despite this, we did find some very good people who learned as we went along. But by not having a proper recruitment process and role description, you do risk ending up with people who aren't really board material. And I've seen community energy co-ops being held back by this. And I think there are two sort of syndromes that you can see sometimes in co-ops. The first is what we call founder syndrome, where people hold on to a past version of the organisation and resist change. And this can apply to any long-standing board member, not just the actual founders. And I think the other thing is job for life syndrome, where people believe that being on the board of a community energy co-op is a job for life. And this leads to groupthink and, again, resistance to change. And organisations that have these people, these kind of behaviours on their board, can lack skills in some areas. And so, for example, Community Energy Birmingham has always lacked skills in marketing because we haven't really had a succession strategy for many years. And if you look at the Community Energy Birmingham website, then I think, unfortunately, it reflects a weakness in that area. The guidance that we've heard tonight on is excellent, and there is some really good guidance in there. The Co-ops UK Code of Governance for co-ops, I think, is really valuable. And in particular, one thing that I've become aware of the importance of in the last couple of years is the 9-year rule, where the Code of Governance says that nobody should be on the board of a co-op for more than 9 years. Now, this isn't law, it's voluntary, it's guidance. But many co-ops and cooperators have voluntarily implemented it to avoid the job for life syndrome and the founder syndrome, because these behaviours are a barrier to succession, they're a barrier to innovation, and they're a barrier to diversity, and lead to boards socially replicating themselves. And founder syndrome makes new recruits feel uncomfortable. And I've been told this by people who've come onto the board of community energy co-ops and left. So in 2022, I stood down for Community Energy Birmingham because I'd been on the board for actually slightly more than 9 years, and because it's, I didn't feel it was a job for life. So I'm no longer a member of the board, but I'm still actively involved in Community Energy Birmingham. And Community Energy Birmingham now has a policy of a managed recruitment policy, and has succeeded in attracting a wider range of skills and talents, which is good, because I feel that, my job as a director, I've done everything that I can. And I'm a director of City Saves Credit Union, which has voluntarily adopted a 9-year rule So I will have to stand down in 2027 after 9 years. I also think that I also think that, I mean, when I joined Community Energy Birmingham, I was a member of a number of small co-ops, and I think it was believed that small was beautiful, especially in community energy. And in many ways, small is beautiful, but there is a balance between being locally accountable and, you know, knowing people in your area and being known by people and being financially viable. And I think there is now a recognition that below a certain level, co-ops such as credit unions, housing co-ops are not financially viable if you want to make a real impact. If you want to install 10 kilowatts of solar on a scout hut, then small is definitely beautiful. But if you want to make a real impact, then we need to look at models such as Ripple Energy, which is a co-op that has the financial viability to undertake big scale renewable energy projects that have a real carbon impact. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was bang on. And then lastly, from Andy O'Brien of Bristol Energy Co-op. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Andy O'Brien, co-founder and director of Bristol Energy Cooperative. But I'm actually from Preston originally, so this is quite nice for me to be returning to my roots on this call tonight. Yeah, like Catriona and Phil, we are also a community benefit society. And we were established in 2011, and we were quite lucky that Bath and West Community Energy up the road from us had started off maybe 18 months before us, so we were able to sort of borrow a lot of what they'd done. We had good support from Cooperatives UK. Also, Power to Change is another organisation to look at. They probably provide some element of funding just to help you get through the actual admin. I mean, as Laura said, the actual cost of setting up a community benefit society are actually really small. It's the time element which is your biggest cost, really. But yeah, there are lots of people out there who can help. So we all started off as volunteers, and we went down the community benefit society route because we definitely wanted to be doing energy generating projects. So our first share offer was for £88,000 to do 2 community roofs. So yeah, we were all volunteers then. We're not now. We've now we've now got 1,500 investor members, and we've done, I think it's 21 energy projects. And that's about 10 megawatts. It's primarily solar with some battery storage and also microgrids. And we are now at the point that we do have paid staff. I'm paid staff, and yeah, it has been a switchback, partly because just the way over the last decade, there's been in some ways very little support for community energy. So a lot of groups that were trying to set up, say, a few years ago, and had plans to do, say, solar, were sort of stymied when the feed-in tariffs were killed off by the government. And so there are lots of groups who, were ready to go a few years ago who couldn't quite get there, but hopefully are beginning to get back involved again. I say the one of the hardest things is we were so focused on doing our first share offer and raising the funds and getting the solar built that almost like maybe not that many of us have really thought about what happened next. I mean, we're literally like, there were 6 founders, and within 6 months, many of those founders had actually gone on to do other things. They were still maybe technically directors, but they weren't actively involved. And so it's suddenly, if you're not careful, a lot of work ends up being put on the shoulders of a few people. So it's certainly worth thinking at that stage, at the early stage, what is your sort of slightly longer term plan if you are successful and you raise your share offer money and you do your installs. So what I'd do there, if you almost like go back 6 months before you actually set up any organization, any sort of actual institutional organisation, some of my top tips would be start with something achievable. So don't go for too big a target at the outset. Share the loads to avoid sort of burnout. Map out the skills that your team needs. Everything from marketing, finance, admin, IT, etc. And get the message out that you're looking for people. You don't have to have a fully running project, or you don't have to be constituted before you start telling people what you're looking to do, and people will like to get involved. So I'd certainly sort of, especially about these days with social media, it's much easier to get your message out that way. I'd also approach, say, the regional offices of big law firms or finance firms, because chances are they'll have staff there who want to do pro bono work around climate change, and actually would welcome, say, being on the initial steering group or joining the board later. And in the same way, make contact with the sustainability officers at your local council, because they may be able to provide different support in different ways. They may even have assets that you could put, say, solar on, but actually they could also help put you in touch with other people, and they may have funds for startup as well, startup support. But I mean, because we've been going now for a decade, we're lucky that we have got quite a strong investor base, or a membership base, and so we've managed to get people who did invest in the share office who have joined the board. But it certainly is something, as Phil said, really, that you've got to think of in terms of recruitment. You've actually got to write almost like a job description of what you're looking for, and promote that through almost like lots of different channels in the community sector, not just in the community sector, because you're actually looking to bring in professionals, whether it's legal or financial or marketing, whatever, who don't know about community energy, that do have those skills. So if you can let them know what you're looking for, then they bring those skills in that you don't have.
That's absolutely great, Andy. Thank you very much. So we've got, I'm aware we're running about 10 minutes late, so I just want to give people a chance to ask any questions. I think there's been some quite active discussion in the chat, and some questions have already been answered there, but there's one that hasn't been, from Sue Jefferson for Laura. A question for her, if easy. We're a CIC and have various initiatives, but looking to partner with a private investor / developer / operator of an energy project, where the local community businesses and us, we will benefit. Is an SPV the best solution for this? Are you able to answer that, Laura?
It's probably one of those where it depends. That's such a lawyerly answer, but it would depend on, I'd need a bit more information to be able to advise properly. I think it's worth mentioning that SPV, for those that don't already know, stands for special purpose vehicle, and it isn't a legal structure in itself. So there isn't a legal structure SPV. It just means a legal entity that's set up to run a special project. It's got a special purpose, so it's in the name. So I suppose the question would be what that SPV would look like and what legal structure you're looking at. And then that goes back to that slide in my presentation that asked about all the objectives and aims of your organization, and how that's the first thing to think about, really. So I think before you look at what legal structure it should be, look at what the aims and objectives are, and how it's being financed, and all those other points, and where the ownership needs to sit, and that will then inform your legal structure. But by all means, drop me an email, and we can arrange a quick chat about that separately.
And were there any other questions that people had? I really enjoyed the kind of reflections from Andy and Phil about kind of getting the right board member and sort of recruiting very mindfully for the skills that you need. I think that's really interesting. But I wondered if there was anything else that anybody wanted to ask. Yeah, if you unmute yourself.
Yeah. At some point after startup, you're going to get to employing people, and at that point you need to be sort of aware of employment law. How have people dealt with that? And was it straightforward, or is that quite a hill to climb?
What we've done, we've actually used a third-party company, actually called Citrus, Citrus, who provide a sort of a whole HR service, and you pay like a monthly fee for that service, and they have been very good, and they yeah, it's like a one-stop shop for us. You know, if we any
Right.
question like that, we just go to them.
Excellent.
Community Energy Birmingham doesn't employ anyone, but we do have a project manager who is at freelance. And I think, you know, but I'm aware that there's a number of bigger renewable energy co-ops in places in London and Brighton and obviously Manchester that do directly employ people, and they're quite professional in their setup. I think the other interesting model especially in the Midlands, but also beyond, is share energy. Share energy. So what share energy does is it takes a lot of the admin pressure off volunteers, and so co-ops pay share energy a fee to do their back office, and that's a lot of the stuff that an administrator would do, and I think that's been a really successful model for a whole number of co-ops. And I know there are other co-ops around the country that provide a similar service, and so, you know, I think for a startup co-op, I think it's always worth considering that option.
Thank you very much.
Just for anybody not following the chat, Simon Borkin has said, finding a board member with HR expertise really helps for when the organisation starts employing individuals. And Paul Smith says, what means should the community energy group use to engage and generally encourage a generally disinterested community? That's a good question. If you'd like to respond to that.
I suppose it depends on what the community is disinterested in. I mean, my view is that if for a renewable energy co-op that is about raising community shares for community renewable energy, if you've got a good offer, then there will be people out there who will buy shares. But having said that, I do think it's fair to say, if you read the Community Energy England State of the Sector report, then, you know, there are some parts of the country where community energy groups are more successful than others. And yeah, there are bits of the country, some of them are areas of economic disadvantage, but not exclusively that people are disengaged. And I think it is fair to say that, and so in those areas, and also, you know, co-ops that are advising people on energy saving in their own homes, retrofit, if you want to call it that, although I personally don't like that word. Again, you know, there will always be some people that are interested in that, but they may well be people in the most affluent areas, people with money to spend on their own homes, and people with the time to do research and so on. And so, I mean, if I think a lot of energy co-ops start off with the idea that we represent the whole community, and I think that is a very laudable aim, but we tend to end up representing a certain section of the community, and whereas there are co-ops, I mean, my personal view is that there are co-ops in London, such as South East London Community Energy, Crew Energy, Brighton and Hove Energy Services Co-op, that I think have succeeded in engaging a much broader layer of the population than, for example, you know, some co-ops that I've been involved in. And my view is, what is different about those co-ops is that they are they are led by people who have a wider background than just renewable energy. They're not, the leadership of those co-ops is not necessarily, they're not necessarily experts in renewable energy. They're led by people who are social entrepreneurs and cooperators in the widest sense, and they have a broader skill set that I think, and I think that represents a break. I think that the early renewable energy co-ops tended to attract people whose main interest was renewable energy. The feed-in tariff based business model became less and less relevant for obvious reasons, and I think those co-ops that have diversified their business model have succeeded in growing, succeeded in engaging wider layers of people, and I think that is to do with the people that lead them.
Just to add to that, we felt that we needed to work fairly hard at this, because a lot of people don't understand what community energy is. So we spoke at parish council meetings, district council meetings, engaged the county council. We carried out an energy forum and got some really good speakers in, including Steve Shaw from Power for People. So 200 people attended that. And then we've just started to roll out the Future Energy Landscapes, which actually comes from the Centre of Sustainable Energy. And it's about bringing communities in to think about current energy consumption and renewable energy projects, and what the community can do from a really sort of bottom level up, and thinking about renewable energy, because we feel that if we do, imminently, we hope to go out to share offer, and then people really need to understand what they're investing in. So we felt that that's quite an important part of our work from, when we became a constitution in July 2022, so we're still quite new, and I've been really reaching out to the community.
I think it was, I hope you don't mind if I add something in as well. I think there is something about kind of tying your community energy project to things that people already care about, whether they care about kind of community energy or not, because it's kind of like, for example, the wind turbine, the community wind turbine that was erected in Avonmouth on the edge of Bristol, that didn't start out as a climate project at all. So this is a kind of really sort of isolated, disadvantaged community with quite difficult problems, where all the services are basically disappeared. And so that community was looking to find something that would generate an income so that they could support, reintroducing community services and supporting their communities. And so it came about as a sort of community resilience project and an income source, and it wasn't sort of sold on the basis of that community being interested in climate or renewable energy at all, basically. So I think tying it back to things that your community already cares about, whether or not that's renewable energy and climate issues. And Simon said, I think a strong proposition around how profits will be reinvested can be a powerful way to build support with communities, i.e. how profits are distributed back to the community to varied projects and activities. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. Did anybody have any other questions? I think we've finished all the questions in the chat. Okay, so it looks, unless anybody wants to come in, it looks like you're drying up. So I think we'll start to bring the session to a close. You can interrupt me if you like. But I'd like to reintroduce James Johnson, just to sort of give a closing 5 minutes summing up, really, and just to give a few reflections on the fund, the Community Energy Fund. Okay, thanks. Over to you. Sorry, can't hear you, James, I'm afraid.
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm probably still quiet, and I'll have to try and solve this problem. So I found that really fascinating. I'm very grateful to our speakers. We work on the kind of technical and eligibility side of the problem, rather than support groups to establish themselves, which is of course vital. So really grateful that groups in the Northwest have had a chance to hear how it's done from groups out from elsewhere, and I'm hoping that will be relevant to others. I don't have a lot more to add on the subject of governance, except to ask if there's any further information people would like to either sort of put that in the chat or follow up with us to explain it, because we've got a few more of these webinars to do and we like to target them at the needs of groups. So maybe there's an angle that you want to know more about, and we can find a way to get you some information. There's a sort of network effect here that we're just kind of capitalizing on, lots of groups around the country supporting each other, and we're looking to fill gaps of where information is not, in the accessible format. The government's got a call for evidence out on barriers to community energy, recently launched. I'm going to put that in the chat. We're promoting that on our channels. I just thought I'd let this group know. It means stopping what you're doing and looking at a government call for evidence, but if that's of interest to anyone, we'd like to know. Potentially we'll pull some groups together to discuss. We're government funded, we can't really respond back ourselves on consultations. We can certainly convene people who want to discuss.
James, we're planning to feed back, so we can sort of we can feed that back, those messages, if you want to share any comments with us.
So yeah, I mean, I wonder if anyone's got any reflections on this evening, if it was useful. It's hard sometimes when the speakers are speaking, we're receiving questions, just to know if this has landed well. So you all have your own opinion. I'm not inviting everyone to give one, but is anyone got a kind of reflection, or is there anyone else burning to know about an aspect of community energy that we can go away and think about? Maybe not, and we can leave it there.
Okay, well, perhaps everybody can reflect on that, and if something comes up in the next couple of days, by all means, email myself or James. I'll pop my email address in the chat. And just while I'm talking, if you wanted to know about the Future Energy Landscape workshop community engagement process that Catriona talked about, I can tell you about that. Okay, many thanks for coming, everyone, and thank you very much to all the speakers. It was a really brilliant session from my perspective. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
For organising everything.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.